From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Whenever it is safe, we leave. But if there is no safety, where can we go? Should these children die? We're not worried about ourselves. We're concerned about the children, of the future of the children.
More than 130,000 people have been displaced as Turkey escalates its invasion of northern Syria. The death toll is unknown. As President Trump orders the full withdrawal of U.S. troops from northern Syria, the Kurds have reached a deal to align with Syria and Russia in an effort to protect themselves from the Turkish onslaught. We'll get the latest. Then we mark Indigenous Peoples Day as more cities and states across the country are rejecting the federal holiday of Columbus. We'll look at the record of this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed.
If there is peace between Ethiopian and Eritrean people, the Horn of Africa region will be a region of peace and development. Our people who live scattered as refugees and humiliation will come back with dignity. Our citizens will not be sold and exchanged like commodities.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Syrian troops are massing near the Turkish border one day after Bashar al-Assad's government reached a deal to help protect the Kurds from Turkey's deadly air and ground assault. The Kurds had been allied with the United States up until last week when President Trump abruptly pulled U.S. troops from northern Syria, paving the way for Turkey's assault. More than 130,000 people have already been displaced over the past 5 days since Turkey invaded northern Syria. The death toll is unknown. Turkey says over 500, quote, terrorists have been neutralized. Turkey frequently refers to Kurdish groups as terrorists. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is reporting Turkish-backed proxies have shot dead 9 Kurdish civilians, including a prominent political leader, Hevrin Khalaf, who was killed along with her driver on Saturday. She was the Secretary General of the Future Syria Party. Kurdish authorities are reporting 785 people affiliated with the Islamic State, including women and children, escaped from a Kurdish-controlled displacement camp in northern Syria. The New York Times is reporting U.S. forces failed to transfer 6 high-value Islamic State prisoners out of Syria. This is Defense Secretary Mark Esper speaking with Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan.
I spoke with the president last night after discussions with the rest of the national security team, and he directed that we begin a deliberate withdrawal of forces from northern Syria.
A deliberate withdrawal from the entire country?
From northern Syria.
From northern Syria.
Which is where most of our forces are.
So the 1,000 troops,
That's
how
correct.
long and over what time period will you be pulling
it'll
back?
be a deliberate withdrawal, and we want to conduct it as safely and quickly as possible.
Turkey is facing increasing international condemnation for invading northern Syria. France and Germany have halted arms exports to Turkey as calls grow for a European Union-wide arms embargo. The Turkish President, Tayyip Erdogan, is slated to visit the United States next month. President Trump has defended his widely criticized decision to withdraw troops from Syria by saying it's time to bring the troops home. This is Trump speaking at a Minnesota rally Thursday.
We were supposed to be in Syria for 30 days. We've now been there for 10 years. We were supposed to be in Afghanistan for a short period of time. We're now going to be there for close to 19 years. It's time to bring them home.
In fact, Trump has not said the troops withdrawn from northern Syria will be coming back. And less than 24 hours after his Minnesota campaign stump speech, the Pentagon announced it's deploying an additional 1,800 U.S. troops to Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, in more news on Syria, a New York Times investigation has revealed how Russian warplanes have repeatedly bombed hospitals in Syria, including 4 hospitals in a 12-hour period May 5th and 6th. It's a war crime to recklessly or intentionally bomb a hospital. From April to September, more than 50 hospitals and clinics in opposition-held Idlib province were attacked. Russia's backed Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad in his brutal effort to recapture territory from opposition groups. A federal appeals court has ruled President Trump must comply with a House committee's subpoena for 8 years of his financial records. Friday's ruling affirms an earlier ruling by a lower court. Last week, President Trump said he will not cooperate with the congressional impeachment inquiry, including refusing to turn over documents about his financial records. President Trump is again facing allegations he is personally inciting political violence and violence against journalists after news surfaced about the broadcast of a video in which a fake President Trump shoots, stabs, and brutally assaults journalists and political opponents. The New York Times reports the video was broadcast at a Miami conference for Trump supporters last week. In the video, the fake Trump shoots a number of people whose faces have been replaced by the logos of news media organizations. He also physically assaults California Democratic Congressmember Maxine Waters, hits former President Barack Obama in the back, and lights Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders' head on fire. In media news, Fox News veteran chief news anchor Shepard Smith has quit. Smith was one of the few prominent Fox News voices to express skepticism about President Trump, at times criticizing the president for his repeated lies and xenophobia. To the shock of many, Shepard Smith announced his departure from the network at the end of his Friday newscast. Joe Biden's son, Hunter, says he'll step down from the board of Chinese company BHR after President Trump repeatedly attacked Hunter over his overseas business practices and openly called for the leaders of Ukraine and China to investigate his political rival Joe Biden and his son for corruption. Trump's apparent effort to pressure Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to investigate Hunter Biden is at the center of the House's impeachment inquiry. On Sunday, Hunter Biden's lawyer said if Biden is elected, his son would not serve on the boards of or work on behalf of foreign-owned companies. In Fort Worth, Texas, outrage is growing after a white police officer shot and killed an African-American woman by shooting through the window of the woman's home while responding to a non-emergency call for a wellness check. A neighbor had called the non-emergency line after seeing that 28-year-old Tatiana Jefferson's front door was open. When the police officer arrived, Jefferson and her 8-year-old nephew were playing video games. The officer shouted through Jefferson's bedroom window to put her hands up, then opened fire, killing her. She's the sixth person since June has been killed by one of the police department's officers. Her killing comes after white off-duty police officer Amber Geiger was convicted of murder for killing her black neighbor, Botham Jean, in his own apartment in Dallas. She had walked in thinking, she said, it was her own apartment before she shot him dead. In Japan, at least 40 people have died and over a dozen are still missing after Typhoon Hagibis swept through central and eastern Japan Saturday. Experts say it was the worst storm to hit Japan in at least 60 years. It dumped record levels of rain across parts of Japan, causing at least 25 rivers to burst their banks. This is typhoon survivor Ria Hasegawa.
Water came in immediately, and I felt the water gradually go up in the dark. It was scary, and I was worried about our lives. I even thought that might be the end.
In Ecuador, 2 weeks of massive indigenous-led protests have forced the government to cancel planned austerity measures and withdraw from a $4.2 billion loan package from the International Monetary Fund. The major victory came after televised negotiations between the Ecuadorian government and indigenous groups on Sunday. At least 7 people were killed in the protests. Over 2,000 more were arrested or wounded. Celebrations broke out in Ecuador's capital, Quito, Sunday night after the deal was reached. This is Marco Casagallo.
It's a celebration for us because we can rest easy after so many days of deaths, massacres, and other things that Ecuador has gone through.
In Uganda, LGBTQ activists are fighting against the possible introduction of a bill that could make homosexuality punishable by death. The law known as Kill the Gays Law was passed in 2014, but was annulled by the Constitutional Court on a technicality. In late September, Democracy Now! Interviewed the Ugandan Prime Minister, Ruhakana at the United Nations General Assembly here in New York City. Can I ask you a tough question about LGBT rights in Uganda? Although a court has struck down the anti-LGBT legislation, still there's intense discrimination against the gay and lesbian and trans community. As Prime Minister, what can you do?
I'm not aware of the discrimination you are talking about, and the courts of law in Uganda have taken a position, and we stand by the decision taken by court in Uganda over the matter.
Do you think LGBTQ people should be respected and protected like any other individual in Uganda?
No single human being should be discriminated.
In Tunisia, retired law professor Kais Saied is poised to be the next president after preliminary results from Sunday's election showed him with a landslide lead over his opponent, a multimillionaire TV mogul who'd been arrested on charges of money laundering and tax fraud. Celebrations filled the streets of Tunis after the early results were announced.
I am so very happy. I am so happy with youth who in 2011 held a revolution and have today nominated the president with wisdom. With hope, I salute Tunisia's youth. They are our future. They are everything. They are the ones who brought back our revolution today.
Professor Kais Saied helped Parliament draft Tunisia's post-Arab Spring constitution and ran on a message of integrity and anti-corruption. But some have criticized his conservative views, which include opposing equal inheritance for men and women and plans to reinstate the death penalty. Spain's Supreme Court has sentenced 9 Catalan separatist leaders to 9 to 13 years in prison over their role in Catalonia's bid for independence. In 2017, the Spanish central government cracked down on separatists, arresting political leaders and charging them with rebellion following an independence referendum and the Catalan parliament's declaration of independence. In London, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was remanded in custody Friday after he appeared via video link for a brief court hearing. The court will decide whether to extradite Assange to the United States, where he faces 18 counts, including violations of an espionage law and conspiracy to hack government computers. The full extradition hearing is slated to start in February. Simone Biles has become the most decorated gymnast in world championship history. On Sunday, the African-American gymnast won her 24th and 25th world medals. Many consider her to be the greatest gymnast of all time. Biles has also been an outspoken survivor of sexual abuse. In August, she called out USA Gymnastics for failing to protect young athletes from Dr. Larry Nassar, the former team doctor who was sentenced to up to 175 years in prison for sexually assaulting and abusing more than 160 young female athletes. Biles is a survivor of Dr. Nassar's abuse.
It's hard coming here for an organization and having had them fail us so many times. And we had won gold. We've done everything that they asked us for, even when we didn't want to, and they couldn't do one damn job. You had one job. You literally had one job, and you couldn't protect us.
And cities and states from coast to coast in the United States are celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day today, rejecting the official holiday of Columbus Day. Last week, Washington, D.C. became one of the latest of over 130 cities, counties, and states to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day. Sunrise ceremonies are being held this morning from Randall's Island in New York to Alcatraz off the coast of San Francisco. We'll have more on Indigenous Peoples Day later in the broadcast. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Syrian troops are massing near the Turkish border 1 day after Syrian President Bashar al-Assad reached a deal to help protect the Kurds from Turkey's deadly air and ground assault. On Sunday, the Kurds agreed in a deal brokered by Russia to hand over 2 border towns to the Syrian government in exchange for protection. The Kurds had been allied with the United States up until last week, when President Trump abruptly pulled U.S. troops from northern Syria, paving the way for Turkey's assault. On Sunday, Defense Secretary Mark Esper announced the U.S. had ordered all remaining U.S. forces out of northern Syria. More than 130,000 people have already been displaced over the past 5 days since Turkey invaded northern Syria. The death toll is unknown. Turkey says more than 500, quote, terrorists have been neutralized. Turkey frequently refers to Kurdish groups as terrorist. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights is reporting Turkish-backed proxies have shot dead 9 Kurdish civilians, including a prominent political leader, Hevrin Khalaf, who was killed along with her driver on Saturday. She was the Secretary General of the Future Syria Party. Kurdish authorities are reporting 785 people affiliated with the Islamic State, including many women and children, escaped from a Kurdish-controlled displacement camp in northern Syria. The escape occurred as Turkish-backed forces shelled nearby targets. On Sunday, President Trump's former defense secretary, James Mattis, warned the current turmoil will lead to a resurgence of ISIS. This comes as the New York Times is reporting U.S. forces failed to transfer 6 high-value Islamic State prisoners out of Syria before Trump withdrew troops from northern Syria. Turkey is facing increasing international condemnation for invading northern Syria. The European Union has called on all member states to stop selling arms to Ankara. To talk more about the situation in northern Syria, we're joined by Özlem Güner. She is an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at the City University of New York and a member of the Emergency Committee of Rojava. She is from Turkey and of Kurdish origin. Professor Özlem Güner, thanks so much for being with us. Can you talk about what you understand to be the latest situation now in northern Syria?
Thank you for having me, Amy. Well, the situation, as you just said, that Kurds needed to have a deal. So we need to just look at the situation just a little back and see that last year, actually at the beginning of this year in January, President Trump once again said that he's going to withdraw the troops from Syria and so leaving the Kurds alone. And this didn't happen because there was a lot of reactions against this. And then at the time, he had said that, well, we're going to do this, but in time and in due warning so that our allies there can protect themselves. But this didn't happen because just a random phone call this past week between Erdogan and Trump, he all of a sudden decided to take all troops out of there without any notification, without any time for the Kurdish troops to protect themselves. So once they were left unprotected, and it's important to realize that it's not just President Trump, but we tried very hard to develop international solidarity against this, to call for a no-fly zone, so that even if the U.S. troops get out of the place, that the Kurds can be protected with their self-defense measures combined with the no-fly zone, so that Turkey cannot do air attacks, which is the majority of losses last time happened because of this. So this did not take place. This did not go through. There's no protection from the U.S. whatsoever. It was just very prompt taking of the troops out of there. So the Kurds, in order to escape genocide, had to make a deal. And this is a shame because they had to make a deal with a regime that has been repressing them for decades now in order to protect themselves.
So explain what this deal is, how it happened. It was brokered by Russia.
Yes, it was brokered by Russia. Russia basically, once the U.S. withdrew from the region, Russia became the major power in the region, controlling and negotiating between Turkey, Assad forces, and the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. So Russia is the only actor in the playing field right now, in addition to Iran, but right now we're speaking of the Russian leadership. And so the terms of the deal are still unknown because for the part of the Kurds, their urgent need for self-protection and to prevent genocide made them just urgently accept this offer from the Assad regime. Their hope is that they can keep their autonomy. This is what the leaders of the Syrian Democratic Forces were saying, that this is just to protect the borders for now and to prevent the Turkish invasion, Turkish war. Turkish genocide, Kurdish genocide at the hands of the Turkish forces. And especially, just you mentioned this, and it's very important to understand that Turkey, it's not just the ISIS fighters escaped. Turkey actually bombed the ISIS prisons so that they can escape. So Turkey is, actually Süleyman Soylu, the Turkish interior minister, 5 days ago, when asked at a TV program, when Turks were concerned about a potential ISIS attack, he was like, be comfortable, no need to be concerned. They don't have any option but to ally with us. So they're very openly allying with ISIS.
Let's go to President Trump, who was responding to questions from reporters last week, asking what will happen to ISIS fighters in the region who are imprisoned and who could escape. He said, well, they'll escape to Europe. Yes. This is what he said.
ISIS fighters escape and pose a threat elsewhere. Well, they're going to be escaping to Europe. That's where they want to go. They want to go back to their homes, but Europe didn't want them from us.
Your response to what Trump just said?
Well, this is, this is just outrageous. This is just outrageous. There is the reemergence and resurgence of ISIS that happened because of Trump's sudden decision to withdraw the troops without any protection whatsoever, without any plan to do something with these ISIS fighters and also their families. And it's very important to understand what we call ISIS families as women and children. These are fighters. They have done enormous human rights violations in the regions. There's tons of interviews with these women in the camps, in the refugee camps. And so they are letting them free to kill the Kurds aligned with the Turkish forces. So Trump says that it's Europe's responsibility. But
Trump said, actually, he said that, the ISIS fighters will go to Europe, and he made very clear they will not come to the United States.
Well, we know what happened. We know how they can mobilize to attack and make terrorist attacks in all parts of the world. So this is, and especially for someone who's been using this discourse of terror for such a long time and threat for such a long time, it's outrageous not to see the imminent threat, and it's outrageous to not see the cooperation of Turkey and the open statement that we're going to cooperate with ISIS, that we're going to use the forces, the jihadists, the ISIS, in addition to the Turkish land forces and air forces, to attack an unprotected territory. And the only means that these people have is self-defense. And it's important to understand that this is not just the Kurds in the region who are under threat, but the minorities and religious minorities who have been especially targeted by ISIS. So they are looking for revenge. They're looking for first exterminating these leftover populations that they started, the Yazidi genocide that they had committed and enslaved thousands. And and letting them both operate in that region and then saying they will go to Europe, and we know the danger that they impose to the world. This is basically President Trump's fault, but also
what do you say about Trump tweeting today, Kurds may be releasing some to get U.S. involved, to get us involved?
Well, this is, we all tweeting. Who tweets about these issues? Seriously, why would Kurds do that? We know, this is just to bring a human face to this. We saw a woman holding her baby, crying, her dead baby, saying that we have fled Kobani. Her husband died in Kobani. Now her daughter died again at the hands of Turkish forces, again cooperating with the jihadis and ISIS. Why would they do such? I mean, the ISIS, the losses that the Kurds suffer at the hands of ISIS is 11,000 people. And
Explain,
these are civilians.
11,000 people.
11,000 people
who?
Fighting against ISIS were killed. So the major losses
in northern Syria.
In northern Syria. So so Trump, as we know historically, there is the role of Europe by colonizing this region of the world, by separating Kurds into 4 different nation states, whom repress Kurds in different forms, and we weren't able to build international solidarity to protect, to do something against this colonization over the century. And then, this is important because then the U.S., it's important to say that when he says we don't have a responsibility, it's not our fault. Who created the jihadis? Who created ISIS? Who made it in such a big threat to the world in the first place? So we need to understand the U.S. involvement in this region.
Explain that history.
So if you look at it, Europe first, because it was the colonizing agent of the early construction of this region and early separation of Kurds under 4 nation states, denying their sovereignty, so denying their self-defense. And also, right now, everybody's like, who is terrorist? PKK, and Erdogan is using this, that they are terrorists. We have annihilated 400, 500 terrorists. They are called terrorists because Europe had denied sovereignty from them. And so when they were denied to be a nation state, their forces of self-protection, self-defense was called terrorism. And then we know the World War II and the U.S. involvement in this region, and so how the U.S. has created these, first it initiated, the Assad regime, these repressive regimes to suppress the left in the Middle East and different countries, the Ba'ath regime in Iraq, and the Turkish Sunni Islamic neoliberal capitalist regimes, the right regimes against the Turkish left. So they have cultivated this region, and then we know since early 2000, especially following September 11, it's created this war on so-called terror, reviving, recreating these jihadi forces, these Islamic forces, and just letting them to run the region according to the U.S. interests. So the major role that the U.S. has played in creating these monsters that then killed, massacred the people of the region, and then denying responsibility for this is outrageous.
I want to ask you about Hevrin Khalef.
Yes.
The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that Turkish-backed proxies shot dead 9 Kurdish civilians, including this prominent political leader. She was the Secretary General of the Future Syria Party. Who was she?
Well, she was a human rights defender. She was also working there. As you know, one of the major successes of the Syrian revolution has been to promote women and has been to fight against patriarchy. So she was one of these major figures, a human rights defender who was very active. And this is, they will attack, first, human rights defenders. They will attack women, as this act is showing, that especially the jihadi and ISIS forces have been very famous in attacking. And as you know, she was, we don't know the exact what happened there exactly, but we know that there was sexual violence. And so this is very important that they are going to attack these people who have been cultivating a democratic, non-patriarchal, gender egalitarian system, because this is what not just ISIS, but the Turkish government is standing with the jihadis who are very suppressive, very patriarchal, and who can't tolerate women being in the forefronts. And so women have been the targets first, women, and then it's going to be the religious minorities, obviously all Kurds. So there is, It's just outrageous, not just what the Trump administration did, but I think it's time for also the left to rethink about Turkey's attempts to become the regional power and to see how Turkey is colonizing these places, these people, with the use of the jihadis and ISIS, and to be against this, to really create a strong stance against this.
So President Trump, at about the same time that he had his conversation with Erdogan 2 Sundays ago, and then announced that the immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops, not that he's saying they'll go home, because it was then almost immediately announced that the Pentagon is going to send 1,800 more troops on top of the thousands more they had already said a few weeks before to Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
The significance of this.
So thank you so much for bringing that, Amy, because people think, well, they celebrated. And this is why I'm
anti-war forces who really want to end the war.
And this is what I'm saying, that the U.S. left should really reconsider its foreign policy and its understanding of the region and how this region and the cultivation of this region has been based on colonialism and imperialism. And because the troops are a very minor part of the role of the U.S. in the region. Well, first of all, it's replacing these troops. So we're not even talking about the troops leaving the region. It's just putting the troops, taking them from here and putting them there. So letting these people get massacred because I made a deal with Turkey. And then because we're in good relations with Saudi, we're going to send them there. So first of all, troops, even though it's a minor issue in the whole region and the governing of the region, even the troops are not brought back to the U.S. They're just replaced. But also there's much more. I mean, the armament deal, where's Turkey getting its weapons? Where's Turkey getting its airplanes to attack one of the most defenseless populations of the world? It's getting it from the US and European companies. So their complicity in this war against Kurds in the past century, and especially this recent episode, is very striking and is...
Trump also, after announcing they were withdrawing troops from that area, not necessarily bringing them home, also announced he'll be having a meeting at the White House with Erdogan. The Washington Post ran a piece saying Trump's decision on Syria crystallizes questions about his business and his presidency. Yes. The article notes Trump himself has acknowledged his conflict of interest with Turkey. Even after Trump became president, Trump Towers Istanbul remained part of the Trump organization, continued to generate revenue for Trump himself.
Exactly. Trump doesn't have business interest in Rojava. When he's saying, well, we don't have interest in there, he doesn't have interest in there. He doesn't have hotels. He doesn't have companies in Rojava. And we all know that Rojava is an anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, ecologically friendly, ecologically sensitive democracy, pluralist democracy. This area of northern Syria that's led by Kurdish coalition forces, and also other ethnic minorities, religious minorities, who were able to live peacefully in a region that was under the attack of ISIS, and in the midst of the war, they were able to create a pluralist, feminist, ecological democracy. So obviously, Trump's interests does not lie with this. His economic interest does not lie with this region. His ideological interest does not lie with. So that is why it is us, the U.S. and the left, who needs to see what's happening and to support this region.
As we wrap up, what happens now? The Kurds have made a deal with Syria.
Yes. So what happens now is that we really need to push for the Kurdish autonomy. Mazlum Kobani, one of the leaders, commanders of the Syrian Democratic Forces, said that we had to make this deal to protect our people against genocide. So, and it's important because we need to make sure that we create international solidarity. That first of all, I mean, there are economic sanctions against Turkey to try everything to bring, the Turkish occupation down. But at the same time, to make sure that Syrian Democratic Forces is a legitimate political actor while we're pushing the leaders to bring Turkey to make peace in the region and Syrian Democratic Forces to establish its autonomy, because this is under threat. And right now, they're making this deal they might lose their autonomy. They might be giving into the regime. The Assad regime has
which they have fought for so long.
The Assad regime has been violent against Kurds for decades. It's not like they want to make this negotiation. They have to, because the U.S. left them unprotected, because the U.S. wasn't able to establish no-fly zone that would give them some protection. And now Assad can imprison, can torture, can kill, can murder the leaders of the Syrian Democratic Forces. And this really reminds me of, early Turkish massacres where the leaders of the Kurds, such as in Dersim, which is my region, had to negotiate with the Turkish. They had to give in themselves and to protect their people. So they're doing this to prevent a genocide because Trump administration betrayed them, and because the U.S. left does not, and the European left, the world left has not developed mechanisms and solidarity to protect them. So it's a shame that they had to turn to another dictator to protect themselves from one dictator.
Özlem Gunnar, I want to thank you for being with us. Of course, we'll continue to follow this. Assistant Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the City University of New York, member of the Emergency Committee of Rojava. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org. When we come back, cities and states from coast to coast are celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day today. Stay with us.
Young boy, I'm leaving home, all alone. On the res, I grew up unknown. The world said I couldn't be a king, but in the city I could see a throne. Feeling like the king of the damned in the kingdom of sand. Building castles as my freedom expands, just to watch them fall down as the tides roll in. I never seen a storm come without a wind, and so I idle no more, rat the plight of the poor. Cause educated warriors are vital to war, and we battling oppression. Got me stressing, wondering if I'll ever learn my lesson. Cause I can't let my people go, and I can't let my weakness show. Even when I'm hopeless and I'm pitiful, I keep going on that I'm aboriginal. I got this aboriginal soul, I got this aboriginal flow, I got this pain that I can't shake, ties to my people I can't break. Got this history in my blood, got my tribe that shows me love. So when I rise, you rise, yeah. Come on, let's rise, get it. It's been months since I seen a native that's messing with me.
Aboriginal by Frank Wan. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Christopher Columbus arrived in the Bahamas 527 years ago this week, unleashing a brutal genocide that killed tens of millions of native people across the hemisphere. Well, cities and states across the United States are acknowledging this devastating history by rejecting the federal holiday of Columbus Day and celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, instead to honor centuries of indigenous resistance. Alaska, Maine, Minnesota, New Mexico, North Carolina, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wisconsin have all officially recognized Indigenous Peoples Day. So have more than 130 cities and counties from Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Dallas to smaller places like Livingston, Kentucky, and Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Last week, Washington, D.C. became one of the latest to recognize the holiday. Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, takes its name from Columbus. In a statement before the vote, D.C. Council member at large David Grosso said, quote, Columbus Day was officially designated as a federal holiday in 1937, despite the fact Columbus did not discover North America, despite the fact millions of people were already living in North America upon his arrival in the Americas, and despite the fact that Columbus never set foot on the shores of the current United States. Columbus enslaved, colonized, mutilated, and massacred thousands of indigenous people in the Americas, he said. The movement to replace Columbus Day gained momentum in 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival, when Berkeley, California became the first city to make the change. Earlier protests inspired the movement, including the annual National Day of Mourning in Plymouth, Massachusetts, held on Thanksgiving, to challenge the myth of peaceful coexistence between Native people and the English settlers, the Pilgrims. Well, today, Native American communities are celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day across the country. with sunrise ceremonies at New York City's Randall's Island to California's Alcatraz Island, the former prison and site of a historic Native American occupation and protest against U.S. treatment of indigenous people 50 years ago. Well, for more, we go to Yagawi Hene Oaks. She is Snipe Clan Mohawk of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Executive Director of the American Indian Community House here in New York City. We welcome you to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Can you talk about the significance of this day? We're here in New York. There is a statue to Christopher Columbus in Columbus Circle, and it is not one of those cities that is recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day.
Well, this day, Indigenous Peoples Day, is it's Indigenous Peoples Day every day for me and my community. You know, we have to fight colonization and try to maintain our identity every single day because it's been stripped away from us through efforts and I guess just what we've been through and what's been taken from us from Columbus and his crusade. At the American Indian Community House, one of my goals is to sort of reclaim space, our culture, and find a place and presence within society today. So for us, it's not just a day to celebrate us, it's a day to remind everybody else to take responsibility and step up and rescind things like the doctrine of discovery.
You wrote about the Native American population in New York in a New York Daily News article, What New York City's Indigenous People Deserve. You explain that among cities, New York has the largest population of indigenous peoples. Can you explain the diversity of this population?
Well, from what we know at the Community House, we represent up to 73 different tribal nations in New York City. And based on the census, there's 118,000 Native Americans in New York City. Overall, the entire Native population in the U.S., 70% of natives, of the Native population are urban natives, and New York City being the largest population of all urban natives. So for us to be here and to not have a permanent space or a Native center or any sort of equity and just erased out of society and culture, it's a tough time for us right now. Right now, it's like we're fighting every single day with the system, and we're not heard of, you know. But days like this, Indigenous Peoples Day, is a reminder to everybody else that we're still here.
Can you explain what the Matahata Fund is?
Oh, the Matahata Fund is great. So that was a few people, what we call settlers. You'll see in the language if you visit the site at matahatafund.org. They approached the Community House and worked with a few of our board members in trying to figure out a way that they could contribute to the Native American community in New York City. And together, with all their good minds, they came up with this fund, and it's a sort of campaign where you could donate. You could donate $5, $10, or a larger amount. You could do this online. You could make a pledge, which would be every single month, sort of like the Bernie campaign. You know, $24 a month, that one initial investment, or it could carry on through the whole year. That's what it is.
As you speak, we're going to run a slideshow that was taken yesterday at Randall's Island. And if you can talk about the ceremonies that are taking place right now as we speak, there is a sunrise ceremony, both at Randall's Island and also Alcatraz across the country. And this is the period 50 years ago of uprising.
Well, this is a big year, 50 years. It's the 50-year anniversary for Alcatraz. It's the 50-year anniversary for the American Indian Community House. with all our ceremonies, we celebrate life. We celebrate what creation has given to us. We celebrate, the water, the earth, the moon, the stars, the skies, the animals, all things that we depend on and need and coexist with equally. In Alcatraz, from what I know, they are taking canoes and they're going to visit the island and they're having their ceremony there in unison with the ceremonies that are happening here.
Also, the doctrine of discovery, if you could explain what that is. Last year, representatives of indigenous groups in the U.S. and Canada went to the Vatican to request a retraction of the doctrine of discovery. Explain.
Well, that's the beginning of it all. In 1493, that's when the doctrine of discovery was created.
Pope Alexander VI Papal Bull.
Yeah. And what that does is that gives dominion for white men or for Christians over non-Christians, or rather indigenous people, us. If you're not Christian people, you're not considered humans, or there's nobody there occupying that land or we basically can't have title to land if we're indigenous and non-Christian. And that's always been the root cause of all of this right now, colonization. That's the #1 tool.
Finally, the American Indian Community House that you are the head of, it's also the 50th anniversary.
Yeah.
Explain its origins and what you're doing.
Well, 50 years ago, they're basically battling the same fight where we are today. We're trying to reclaim our culture. We're trying to maintain our presence and trying to exercise our strengths and authority for the future and trying to regain title also. And one of those ways is, for me, one of the directions I want to focus on is bringing attention to the doctrine of discovery. But throughout the past 50 years, it's been a little bit of a struggle. There was some support, and now there's none. 50 years later, the community house is in a place where we have little to no funding. 97% of our funding was taken from us in 2017 by the federal government. So here we are today.
Which coincides exactly with the time that indigenous people around the country have been leading the struggle against extractive industries and are on the forefront of the battle around the climate crisis.
Yeah, we're a threat. The moment things like the doctrine of discovery are rescinded, that challenges all title of land and authority.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Yagoehene Oaks is Snipe Clan Mohawk of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Executive Director of the American Indian Community House in New York. When we come back, we look at the record of this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. Stay with us.
And the fireworks roared like lions, and the children woke up from their beds. And the dreamers, they became elusive. While our memories of the future waited, while our memories of the future waited, while our memories of the future, while they waited. And the roads found their way to one world. Shooting stars remember to fall, and the deserts miss the weight of the water. While our memories of the future waited, while our memories of the future waited, while our memories of the future, while they waited. If this is enough for the one, so
Memories of the Future by Meklet Hedero. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show looking at this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner.
The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2019 to Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali for his efforts to achieve peace and international cooperation, and in particular for his decisive initiative to resolve the border conflict with neighboring Eritrea.
That was the announcement by the Norwegian Nobel Committee on Friday in Oslo. The Ethiopian Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, will receive the award December 10th. The committee praised Ahmed for his role in brokering a historic peace deal between Ethiopia and Eritrea and for lifting the state of emergency in Ethiopia. He's also released thousands of political dissidents from prison, appointed women to a record 50% of cabinet positions. For more, we go to Staffordshire, England, to speak to Awolalo, an associate professor at Keele University School of Law. His recent article for Al Jazeera headlined, "Why I Nominated Abiy Ahmed for the Nobel Peace Prize." Well, let's start there, Professor. Why did you nominate him, and talk about his significance, the youngest leader in Africa today?
Absolutely. I nominated him primarily because of the significant and remarkable changes that he has brought into the Ethiopian state. He's an Ethiopian leader, came to power on the back of persistent struggles by people, a protest that lasted for a period of 3 years, involving 2 states of emergencies. This man came essentially out of nowhere, became a prime minister, changed the political fortunes in Ethiopia, lifted the state of emergency, released thousands of political prisoners, allowed a number of opposition forces that were forced out of the country to come back and participate in democratic politics, and really gave hope and optimism for Ethiopians. So that in and of itself is very, very remarkable. But the Nobel Award was not given because he did these things internally. I think for any leader, it is their duty to do those kinds of things at the domestic level. But he was awarded primarily for what was a transformational, I think, steps that he has taken in stabilizing the Horn of Africa region generally, but specifically what he did in relation to Eritrea, which is a neighboring state with whom Ethiopia has been fighting for a very long period of time. So when he was appointed as prime minister, in his inaugural speech, one of the most important foreign policy statements that he made was reaching out to Eritrea and saying to the Eritrean leaders and to Eritrean people that it is enough and we need to move forward. And shortly after he became a prime minister, he unconditionally accepted the Algiers Peace Agreement. He accepted the boundary decisions, the Boundary Commission's decision, and he made a deal with Eritrea, something that most people thought was impossible. He took risks. He did it against significant internal opposition. He normalized relations with Eritrea and allowed thousands of families who were splintered as a result of that senseless war to reunite once again. So that was hugely significant. But beyond Eritrea as well, he tried to mediate differences between various countries in the region. So between Eritrea and Djibouti, for example, between Eritrea and Somalia, between Somalia and Kenya, in South Sudan, but most recently the peace deal that he managed to broker between the opposition alliance and the Transitional Military Council in Sudan itself. So when you take all of those things together, I think he was clearly a very worthy candidate in terms of the criteria of the Nobel Peace Prize.
I wanted to go to the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed speaking last year.
If there is peace between Ethiopian and Eritrean people, the Horn of Africa region will be a region of peace and development. Our people who live scattered as refugees and humiliation will come back with dignity. Our citizens will not be sold and exchanged like commodities.
So I was wondering if you could give us his biography in a nutshell, an unusual upbringing, interreligious, his family. Tell us about him.
He comes from a very diverse background. His dad is a Muslim, his mom is a Christian. He is ethnically an Oromo. He fought as a soldier in the Ethiopian-Eritrean war, so he understands, I think, the miseries that war brought to people who fought in the war, but generally to people in the frontline area. He was, for a time, director of one of the intelligence agencies in the country. He was also a minister of technology. He, in the last 4 or so years, became the deputy head of the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, the political party that he leads now and from which he comes to become a prime minister. So he's somebody that has a hugely diverse appeal to the different sections in Ethiopia's highly diverse community.
And was a UN peacekeeper in Rwanda. I wanted to turn to an opinion piece in Deutsche Welle by Ludger Shadomsky, who heads the German newspaper's Amharic desk. The article is headlined, "Nobel Peace Prize for Abiy Ahmed, a misguided decision." In it, he writes, quote, "The initial shuttle diplomacy pursued by Abiy and Eritrea's autocratic ruler, Isaias Afwerki, has come to a halt. By now, both countries have rather resorted to forging unholy strategic alliances with countries located beyond the Red Sea in accordance with that age-old motto that Horn of Africa nations ascribe to, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Abiy has received the most prestigious peace prize for a peace that exists predominantly only on paper. Worse still, the award could eventually even torpedo those peace efforts if the Eritrean leadership felt put under pressure to an even greater extent than before." Awolalo, could you respond to this criticism?
I think I read that piece. I think it was a very cynical piece. It is completely uninformed, with very little knowledge of the Ethiopian political landscape and the Horn of Africa's politics. Awards of this nature come with a lot of moral authority. There are certainly risks that they could be abused and used for purposes and ideas that are not consistent with the prize. But at the same time, it is also a very important tool for the recipient to use to advance the peace agenda. This award is not given to the most, to the nicest person or to the kindest person on earth. It is given for something very specific, for an individual who did the most in terms of advancing the cause of peace in the previous years. And I cannot really think of anyone around the world who did that better than Abiy Ahmed. Are there challenges in terms of forging relationships with Eritrea going forward? Absolutely. Eritrea is a highly authoritarian state, a very closed system. It has concerns in terms of everything it does, in terms of every bilateral relationship that it enters into. So in the face of, for example, a democratizing Ethiopia, and a country that is opening itself up to plurality of voices, the Eritrean government would certainly have concerns. But those concerns do not in any way take away from the achievements of the Ethiopian leader or the Ethiopian government, because what Ethiopia did is basically tried to do everything they can to give peace a chance. And I think the segment that you played earlier, where the Prime Minister of Ethiopia was saying that peace in Ethiopia requires a stable and peaceful Horn of Africa, that the relationship that Ethiopia has with Eritrea, making Eritrea some kind of pariah where it is diplomatically isolated through the pressure that Ethiopia was putting on other Western countries, and making Eritrea hell-bent on destabilizing the region, that does not help. It did not help. It will not help in the future. And Abiy's approach is to say that peace and stability in my country is inextricably tied to peace and stability in the region. And what he did, in my view, is try to address that problem as much as he can. But obviously, it takes two to make peace. You're dealing with a highly authoritarian system, a very difficult individual, and there is limits in terms of how much you could push. So some people, for example, link democracy and human rights in Eritrea with this award. So So in a way, I think what is being claimed here is that Abiy is supposed to solve Eritrea's problem, but that's, I think, a slightly different question.
Well, I want to thank you very much for being with us, Associate Professor at the Keele University School of Law in Staffordshire, England. That does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Democracy Now!